The date time keyword in C# is commonly used, but have you ever really explored all that it can do? In this video, we're going to be looking at the DateTime object, what it represents, identifying how to use it to get more relevant data out, manipulating it, displaying it in various formats, and a lot more. We'll also be looking at how the DateOnly and TimeOnly types in .NET 6 will help supplement what DateTime can do. Now, if this is the first time you've watched a video of mine, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. I provide videos here at least twice a week on YouTube to help you grow as a developer. I also have a full set of training courses on imtimcorey.com. I would encourage you to check out all the resources that I have to offer. Let's go over to Visual Studio, and just so you know, I do provide a source code for this video. If you want to have my copy of the source code, I'll do everything on camera, but if you want the source code, it is down in the description. But we're going to use Visual Studio 2022. This is a preview version, means it's not quite out yet, but it is a version we can use in production. So let's create a new project, and we'll create a console application. We're just going to play around with things today. We're not necessarily going to be creating a working application that does something cool, other than just show off DateTime info, let's call it that, and DateTime info app. And we'll use .NET 6, which is the long-term supported version of .NET. So that's the latest version. And yes, it is ready to go live. Even though it hasn't officially launched yet, this is the go live version. So let's hit create. And with that, we now have our console app. Now, if you're not familiar, the console app has changed a little bit because of the fact that we have implicit usings, and we have global usings, and we have the top level namespaces, and a whole bunch of other stuff that comes with .NET 6, and it kind of all accumulates on the program.cs. So everything here is, you could say it's hidden, but it's not really hidden. What it is it's implied. So because we're in program.cs, this is where the application starts. So instead of having our namespace, which would be just DateTime info, and instead of saying static void main, which is a thing we have to do in every program.cs, we just have the code section. So you can put code in here, and this will be inside the static void main method. So just so you know, that's what's going on. Now let's look at DateTime. So what we're going to do is say DateTime, and then we'll say, let's just call it sample1, okay, equals new DateTime. That's our DateTime. Now, DateTime is a read-only struct. So what happens there is it's kind of like a class, and we'll cover structures more in the following videos. But what it is, it has a whole bunch of properties and methods around our data. So let's first start by just doing a console write line sample1. Okay, just print out whatever is in sample1 right now, which is a new DateTime. Let's do that. And when we do, we'll see that we get this DateTime right here, which is January 1st of the year 1 at midnight. So that is the default value for DateTime if we don't give it anything. So that's not terribly useful, but it's good to know where it starts. Okay, so let's talk about how you could use this. So instead of new DateTime, we can say instead is start with a known value, so DateTime.now. And what DateTime.now is it will be the time right now. So right now it is October 22nd, and it is 6:44 p.m. So that's the time right now. And so we can then use that. But we're going to talk through some other things first before we get into how to print out various things. So let's talk about a few more of these properties. So now is going to get the time based upon local time. So I'm in the central time zone. So right now my time is 6:44 p.m. Central Time. However, if we were to want to know about, let's say, Eastern Time, we'll have to do some manipulation on that. Or what we can do is use, instead of now, grab UTC now. UTC for Coordinated Universal Time, which, yes, UTC, Coordinated Universal Time, it switches the acronym around. But that is essentially the time zero, where there's no offset. Okay, there is no offset. And so right now my offset, I believe, is 6 hours. So therefore, it's 5 hours right now because of daylight savings time. Time and date, or especially time, is tricky. So you're gonna have to figure out a lot of these things, and I'll talk you through some ways to help with this. There are other libraries that can help. We'll talk more about DateTime in the future, but DateTime is probably one of the best libraries out there to make it a lot easier to work with date and time in C#. But for the actual DateTime object in C#, just note that this is now UTC time, which then I could convert into any time I want. This is very important because if you're capturing logs and you capture the local time, and one server is on the East Coast and one server is on the West Coast, well, then the West Coast server of the US, then the West Coast server will be logging times 3 hours earlier than the East Coast server, even though they're happening at the exact same time. That could be a problem. Okay. It's also a problem if you say, well, we're only going to have our servers in Central. Cool. We're good. Yeah, but what happens when you have a disaster and you have to fall over to the West Coast backup site? Well, now all your times are 2 hours difference compared to the Central time. And that could be an issue. So by using UTC time, that you know that the time is the same for everybody. Okay, so this would print the same time if you're on the East Coast or West Coast if you use UTC. Now, what you do lose, though, is you do lose that time zone information. You don't know which zone this was captured in, and that can be relevant. Okay, so just note that you're actually losing information when you say UTC now versus just now. However, you are synchronizing your times in a way that's a little more easy because of the fact they're always the same time relative to each other. Okay, so there's now and UTC now. All right, and then we also have the ability to say min value, which we've already seen the min value. That is going to be that January 1st, year one at midnight. But there's also a max value. This is the largest date time value you can have. I guess after this, we just can't have C# anymore. Kind of like the Y2K issues of 20 years ago. Well, now in the year 9,999, when we hit January 1st the next year, we're going to blow up because that's as far as this goes. Okay, so that's the max value you can have for a time, a date time. Now, it is important to note that DateTime does store everything. We've seen this. Let's go back to now, and you'll see that it stores the date and the time. So DateTime stores everything. All right. Now, you can make this nullable as well. So if you wanted to, you could say question mark in front of or after DateTime, and then now we can store a null value in here. This can be really helpful for when you are not sure if it's the start date, the min date, or whether it is a null value. So let's say they haven't given you a date time yet. Well, you store null in there, and that's what databases are used to as well. But then you have a value, you don't have to figure out, is this the min value? Is this the max value? You know, a value that you know isn't a real date. Instead, you just say, no problem. If it's null, then it's not been filled. If it has data in there, then it's a real date time. So that can be helpful as well. There's also the option, let's take this off from nullable. There is also the option of DateTime.today. Okay, so that's going to get today as an object, but the time component will be 0. So if you run this, note that it is midnight. Now, there's still a time associated. And we're going to see the date only in the future and in this video, but that's not the same thing, because this is just today, which is just representing the date, but the time is set to 0. So that is available to you. There's also this idea of let's go today, and then down here we can say ticks. This represents the ticks of the date time of this instance. So a tick is 1/10,000,000th of a second. Okay, and it's going to count up. Notice the very large number right there. It's going to count up from January 1st of the year 1 at midnight. And it's going to tell you how many ticks there have been since then. So lots. All right. So that's min value.ticks and max value.ticks as well. So that'll tell you. So if we did this min value, you'll see that the ticks right here are 0. Okay, because that's the minimum value, which is at January 1st, year 1. Well, the ticks then are 0. So if we had, a day after that, you'd see just the ticks for that one day. But that is the ticks. That's what they're there for. That will give you, again, a set value to work with. Here's how many ticks have been since this point in time. All right. Let's talk about some properties on the date time value. So one that's really useful is day of the week. Okay, so day of the week. What is that? It's Friday. Okay, so it tells you which day it is. And of course, that's a day of the week object, which is going to have one of 7 values, Sunday through Saturday. All right. So that's the day of the week. We also have the option of day of the year. So if you want to know what day is it in the year, what's the 295th day of the year? Getting pretty close to the end of the year. So that can be helpful as well. We also have the option here of is daylight savings time. And this will give you a Boolean. So it's going to indicate, oops, this is a method, sorry. There we go. It's going to indicate whether this instance of date time is within the daylight savings time range of the current time zone. So this is going to tell you, are you in daylight savings time right now? The answer is true. So that will change once daylight savings time turns off. And again, date times, really tricky to work with because of daylight savings time. It's trying to figure out, notice, the time range for the current time zone. So if the time zone does not respect daylight savings time, then it will say false, even when the time zone next to it does respect the time zone or daylight savings time, and therefore it'd say true. So that can be tricky, but that will allow you to figure out whether or not you're in daylight savings time right now. Next up, we have kind. So let's do this. Let's put kind on. We're going to create a second sample. We'll do sample 2, and this will be UTC now. And then we'll do sample 2 kind as well. Makes it a little bit quicker. Okay, so now the first one is based upon local time. The second one is based upon that coordinated universal time. So this allows us to know, hey, what's this value? Is it a local time, meaning has a time zone associated, or is this UTC? Now, there can also be a kind of unknown if it does not know whether it is local or UTC. That can be a very bad place to be, because if you have a date and time but do not know what time zone it's associated with, then you've got a problem, because you don't know what that represents really. It's a nebulous value. So you really want to know what kind it is. Okay, with that, let's talk about ways to manipulate the date time. So this DateTime.now is the local time. So we could say to universal time. So this will convert that to universal time. We could do the same thing down here with our UTC time to local time, like so, and convert it the other direction. So I've just flip-flopped these. So now the top one is the UTC time, the bottom one is the local time, even though that's the reverse of what they started from. Okay, so by saying to UTC or to local, I'm able to change those values out, again, if I know what kind it is. Okay, so now let's do this. Let's comment these out, and we're going to work with sample1.add. Okay, and I can add a number of different things here. So let's talk about the different things we can add, because it's going to introduce a new variable type. So that variable type is the time span. We're going to skip over this and come back to this because I think it's simpler to see, first of all, the other ones, but then we'll come back to time span, talk about it. So we have add hours. So we can take our current time and add some time to it, add an hour to it, and make it 1 hour later, and so on. We can do the same thing with days, hours, milliseconds, minutes, basically anything. We can even add ticks. Okay, so we can add quite a few different things, but let's add hours, and we're gonna say I'm gonna add 3 hours to my time, and that is my DateTime.now. So let's say sample one, and I can just say sample one. It's technically doing a .to string, but we can just say sample one. So now if I run this, we'll see that the time says, oops, I said sample one .add hours, but this returns a date time. I need to say like that. That will overwrite sample one, or I could say, let's just do it right down in line, like so. Okay, just note it's not going to modify the original, it's going to create a new one. So now let's do this, and now we have 9:58 p.m., even though it's currently 6:58 p.m. So we can add hours, days, minutes, and so on to our time. And you may say, well, Tim, but how do you subtract? Because I don't see a subtract method in the list. That's because we can add a negative value. Okay, in fact, let's do this. Let's actually print out the original. So sample one, and then we'll print out this one with the add, this one with the subtract. So we're gonna remove 3 hours from the time, and now we have the original, which is 6:59, the new one, which is added 3 hours, 9:59, and the one that has subtracted 3 hours, and we're at 3:59. So that's how we can manipulate our date time. We can do that for days, hours, minutes, doesn't really matter. Also note, if we decide to change this, notice 30, this will figure out what that means. So it's now just after midnight on the 24th, and it's almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 21st. Okay, today's the 22nd. So this is because the fact that we've changed it 30 hours, it rolled over our date too. It knows about the fact that 24 hours is 1 day. And it will respect things like the start of the year and so on. So that's how we can use add. Now, let's talk about the time span. Okay, this is a type that is often confused as to what it represents. a time span does not represent a single point in time. Instead, a time span represents a span of time, meaning how many hours, minutes, seconds, and so on. So time span, we could do from seconds, from milliseconds, we could do parse, we could do from days, hours, and so on. So we can figure out, we can create a time span where we parse out and say, okay, I want to create a time span. Notice there's 3 different overloads. So we're going to use the first one. There we go. The first one, which is just a string. And this string will represent our time span. So this is going to be our hours. Let's say it's 4 hours, 15 minutes, 13 seconds, and then we can have milliseconds as well. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is going to be how many fractions of a second. So this is 0.12345 out of 10,000. So that's our representation of the milliseconds. So hours, minutes, seconds, notice the dot here, and then milliseconds. This will create a time span for us. And if we just did console right line of time span and run this, we'll see that there is our time span represented. Notice you can go even more fractionally with your milliseconds if you want to. But we can now use this time span to do things like add to our time. So console right line sample1 dot add. Notice the time span value. We can add that time span to it. So our current time, add 4 hours, 15 minutes, 13 seconds, and the fractional as well. So there is the time right now. There is the time that it would be if we added 4 hours. That's from 7 to 11, 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Yep, 15 minutes, which is 4 plus 15 is 19. 13 seconds. So 11 plus 13 is 24. Notice the fractional is not being shown. That's because of the type of how we're printing out this string. Okay, we're going to deal with how to print out more information from our date time. So that time span represents the point between two times. Okay, it does not represent 4 in the afternoon. It does not represent 4 in the morning. It represents the difference between two times. That's why it's called a time span. All right, so be careful there. This is not time only, which is the new keyword in C#. This is the difference between 2 points. Okay, so this gives us our duration of the difference. Okay, so we can now do things like we can parse it out. Oh, by the way, we can also add days here if we wanted to. If we said 5, there we go. So 5 days puts us at the 27th at 11:20 p.m. So just so you know, we can add that additional day. I think day is as high as it goes, but that is possible to add days to it. So we can use time span. We can also get time span. So if we were to grab a time and then let's just take, here we go. Let's just take our sample 1 where you've added in the time span. Let's start there. And we're going to say sample1 dot add TS. So we know what that value is. Okay, we know that value is whatever the local time is right now, added 5 days, 4 hours, 15 minutes, 13 seconds, and so on. So we can now, that's now a new date time. So we can say date time sample3 equals sample1 dot add. Okay, Now we have that, what we can do is we can subtract one date from another. So we can say sample3 dot subtract, and notice we have two options here. We can subtract another date time value, or we can subtract a time span. Let's look at the date time value. That's what we're going to do first. So if we subtract the date time value, then we get a time span in return. So if we have two dates and we say subtract one from the other, then we get a time span, because that's the difference between those 2 points in time. Now remember, it's the full date and time. So it's accounting for everything there. So if you were anticipating how many days are between the two, you gotta be careful, because if the times are off, then you may have one less or one more date or one more day. So that's to be careful of. That's why we use things like today, which is midnight, and so on. But with this, we can subtract, let's say, sample 1. And that will give us a new time span. Now, we can grab this time span, but let's just wrap it in a console write line, so we have it. And this is going to be our difference between these two dates. Now we know what the difference is, because this time span right here. But we've done the addition, got a new date, and then compared this date with this date to get a time span out. Let's just see what that time span is. Right there. That's the time span. Notice it exactly matches this time span up here, because of the fact that we have added in and subtracted those two dates and found the difference. We could also do something else where we say console write line sample. Let's do sample1 dot add, and add a time stamp. I'm sorry, add a time span. Or we can say is sample3 dot subtract, and also subtract that same time span. So we've added time span here. We can subtract the time span back out and get the original date as well. So again, that's the original date and time. That's the date and time after you've added the time span and subtracted it back out. So yes, that's kind of simple, but just want you to know you can do that. You can subtract or you can add time spans. So that allows us to play around with the differences between two dates. But here's where it gets even better. Maybe you say, you know what? We've got this sample, we've got this date right here. Okay, sample 1. And that's today's date and time. And we know that the difference between the two dates is this long. But we want to hit the middle. How do you figure out where the middle point is between the date and time as right now and the end result? So we've done a subtraction. We figure out this is the difference between two dates. We want the halfway point. Not a problem. What we can do is come down here and say, this is going to get a little confusing. So let's do some string interpolation here. Halfway point, and then we'll do our actual work here. So we're going to say that it's sample 1 add, we need a time span, so TS, which is our time span, dot divide by 2. So we're dividing our time span by 2. Remember, the time span is a difference between two dates. So it's 5 days, 4 hours, and so on. So it's now 2.5 days, 2 hours, 7.5 minutes, and so on. Okay, so we're going to add that to our sample 1 and get the halfway point. And that is our halfway point. So here is our original time. Here is the halfway point when we add 2.5 days to it. So 22 at 7 at night, we've now got 25 at 9 in the morning. So that's our 2.5 days from when we're working with. We can do the same thing, not just divide, we can also multiply. So if you want to say, well, that's the halfway point, we want to multiply or go twice as far. So we can say multiply by 2 or by whatever. Let's go triple. So multiply by 3. Just so you know that, yes, we can do this. We're going to multiply by 3, and that's now our triple point, which is November 7th at almost 8 in the morning. So this allows you to play around with these and figure out the differences between dates, multiply, divide, and so on. The time span has a lot of cool stuff. This is not a time span video, but I do want to point out a couple of things in here that you should know about. So there's some really cool stuff in here. For example, besides just multiply and divide, we have totals. And I do want to point this out because this will get confusing. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to comment these out. I'll leave them here, but I'm going to comment them out because it's getting a little overwhelming. Let's comment all that out, and we'll leave that one in, sample 3. Okay, so down here, we're going to start working with the time span. And we're going to say, you know what? I want to see, and there's a lot of cool stuff in here. Let's see the number of days. How many days are in here? All right, so we run this, and we get the number 5. Well, that makes sense because there's 5 days in here. Let's talk about number of minutes. Okay, we get in there, we say 15. You're like, is it though? Because yes, it says 15 here, and that's what we used, but I think that there's more than 15 minutes in this total time span. And that's because this is minutes, not total minutes. Okay? There's also the concept of total on all of our different values. So if we run this again, we'll see the total number of minutes is 7,455 and a fractional. So that's the total number of minutes in that time span. So when you're working with these values, make sure that you understand the values you're getting. Is it total milliseconds or just in milliseconds, the whole number of that fractional piece? So the same thing with a number of different things. There's minutes, there is seconds, there's days, there's ticks, but then down here is where you probably want to live, and that's total days, total hours, total milliseconds, total minutes, seconds. So that's where you find the totals if that's what you're looking for. So if you're saying how many minutes between these two dates, you don't want minutes, you want total minutes. Okay, so just be aware of that difference. Because even if it was, let's say 15 minutes, you would get the number 15, not 15.6. Because it's really 15.6 minutes between the two dates, but we're only taking the minutes themselves, the minute portion of the time span. So just note that's the difference there. Okay. And we also have this idea of duration. So the duration is important. And the reason why, and if we look at this, you're going to say, well, what's the difference here? Because it's still 5.04, 15, yada, yada. Okay. Well, what if this was negative? Okay, so let's just print out sample 3. We've added the time span, okay? So let's just print sample 3. So we have that sample 3 to know that, yes, we're going back in time. Okay, so we've gone back in time to the 17th of October, when today is the 22nd of October. However, notice that the duration is still this value, the 5 days, 4 hours, 15 minutes, 13 seconds, and so on. The reason why is because the duration says it doesn't really matter if you're going one way or the other, if you just want the absolute value, the difference between the two, not worrying about negative versus positive. Okay. Otherwise, you have to make sure that your second date is the one that you use to then subtract the other date from. Otherwise, what happens is you get a negative value. So this way, by saying duration of our timestamp, our time span, that gives us the absolute value that we can then say it's 5 hours between the two of them, or 5 days between the two of them. Okay, so that's time span. Yes, this is a date time video, and I'm not going to go into every type surrounding the date time, but I thought that's important because of the fact that we can do things like date manipulation, where we subtract one date from another, like this. Okay, notice I did the bigger date, subtracting the smaller date. That gives us a positive value. We could flip this around, sample 1 dot subtract sample 3, that would give us a negative value, and then we'd have to do dot duration to get the actual, the absolute value, the non-signed version of that. Okay, so that gives us some differences here. Now let's start working with how to compare dates. Okay, so we have date 1, sample 1 is our now, sample 2 is our UTC now, and sample 3 is our now with 5 days subtracted from it. Okay, so now we can do some comparisons. Okay, so you can say date, not date only, date time dot compare. We can compare two different values. So let's compare sample 1 and sample 3. All right, so we're going to compare these two values and get back a response. And let's actually do a console right line. Let's wrap this thing in it, and we'll say comparing sample 1 to sample 3. Oops, not capital S. And then we'll do the actual comparison right there. Okay, so with that, we will see that the comparison, it says 1. All right, so what does that mean? Okay, that means that sample 3 is greater than, sample 1 is greater than sample 3. Okay, yes, they can get confusing. So let's do this. Let's copy this a couple more times. Actually, I can unpin this to get us a little more space. And we'll compare the opposite direction. Okay, so make sure you modify this. And then we'll do it one more time. And this time we're going to compare sample 1 to sample 1. So comparing sample 1 to sample 3 says that sample 1 is greater. Sample 1 is this one right here. Sample 3 is this one right here. Sample 3 is the smaller one. So it says sample 1 is bigger because it's positive 1. Sample 3 is smaller, so it's a negative 1. And then sample 1 is the same as sample 1, therefore 0. This allows you to compare two dates and just figure out which one comes first. And you can do that with the 1, negative 1, and 0. No, these numbers will not change based upon how great the difference is. It's just going to be if it's bigger or smaller. That's all it cares about, okay? And that does depend on the order you put things in. So if it is greater, if the first one is greater, it's positive 1. If the second one is greater, it's negative 1. And if they're equal, it's 0. All right? So that's the difference there. So there is our comparison. And you've worked with time span as well, but now let's comment that out and let's talk about parsing. There is so much stuff we can do with parsing. We're going to parse on sample 1. In fact, I'm going to comment out not the declaration, but pretty much everything else just to get this stuff off our console. So we have just, I can't parse out the declaration of time span. There we go. So with that, we now have an empty console. The console's not printing anything yet. We just have our sample 1, 2, our time span, and our sample 3. So let's talk about how to print out. So far, what we've been doing is saying sample 1, okay, which technically is toString. That's what happens inside WriteLine, is it does a toString on anything you pass into it. So therefore, we get a value like this. Now, we can manipulate this by passing in what we want to in the toString using double quotes. And the cool thing is this editor now has, and get off my screen, it now has the ability to show us what our options are. And there's a lot of options in here. So let's talk about some of the more common ones, okay? And I'm actually gonna print out a number of these. So what we'll do is we'll actually do this. We're gonna cut this out and we'll do a string interpolation. So you have kind of notes on this. Short date, and then we'll do small d, and then we'll have one more, and this will be a long date, known as a capital D, and then we can do a few more. Let's do times as well. So I'll copy this and paste, and again, the casing matters here. So short time is a small t, and long time is the uppercase T. Let's see these in action. So remember, this is the same date, okay? But the short date is just the date portion. The long date includes the day, the printed out month, and so on. Okay, notice nice formatting. Short time is just 7:25 p.m. Long time includes the seconds that is printed out. But I want you to be clear here. Just because we're printing out just the date does not mean that's all the object holds. This same object is printing out 4 different ways. And we can print out even more ways as well. So that's different ways to quickly just format a date for your screen. Let's do a couple more. Let's copy this, and we're going to, I'll put a space here just to separate them out. And let's look at, I believe it's O. Yep, round trip date time, and round trip date time like so. And we'll see that when we do this, that gives us a lot of information. It says 2021-10-22. That's our date portion. Then it says T for time. It gives it to us in what we in the US call military time, which is the 24-hour time span instead of 12. That way we can see, without having to have the AM and PM, what the number represents. So 19:26:09, and then this is the milliseconds there. So there's our hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. And then we have -5. This tells us our time zone offset. All right. This does not tell you the time zone. It just tells you the offset for the time zone. That's kind of important because there are multiple time zones that have the same offset in a given period of time. Yes, again, that can be confusing. But what this does is it tells me more information than just UTC. Remember, UTC is what we had with sample 2, and that would be just zeros here. But with this, it tells me, okay, we are at the -5-hour offset, so that I could recreate the date and time locally or at UTC using this information. And that's what this round trip date time does, is it gives us all the information so we can basically make a choice if we want to see it later in UTC or if we want to see it in local time for really any given local time that you want. So that is the round trip. All right. And then we have, there's a whole bunch more. Let's go over go over these. So let's start with F, which is the full short. Okay. So this is the full short date time. And then there is the full long date time. And yes, it's important to know these, or at least know how to get to them, or that they're available, because I often see people trying to recreate these with custom formats when they're just there for you as a single letter. So then we can do general short date time and general long date time, and that would be the G's. All right, so let's look at these. So we go. We've got our full short date time, which is Friday, October 22nd at 7:29 p.m. Notice that the difference between this and the long is this includes the seconds, where this one does not. This is the general, that's the full though, which means you get the full date, but the short time. You get the full date and the long time. This is the general date, short time, general date, long time. Okay, so there's the differences there. But again, I usually find that I'm printing stuff like this. So I just capital G, you're good to go. All right, so remember G for good, that's all you need. Now, there's also sortable times. Okay, so let's bring these in. We can get the lowercase s for sortable date time, and we also have the uppercase U for universal. All right, so universal, and then we have the sortable. And again, we can run this and see that the sortable allows us to basically print this in a list and then sort by the characters, and it will properly sort through because it knows all the information it needs without the offset, but knows the information it needs to be sorted in a list easily. Whereas this one right here, universal, gives us the universal time right now, which is UTC. So it's grabbed the offset and said, let's back that up. So you're -5, so add 5 on. And here is the new time. It's actually Saturday at this point at 12:30 in the morning. So again, some cool stuff there, but probably you're going to look at all this stuff and go, I want one little tweak. Okay. Yeah, it happens. It's unfortunate. I personally recommend the capital G, but if you say, no, I really need to have my own stuff, no worries. You can do that. So let's grab one of them. I'll copy it, I'll paste it, and we'll say custom. So instead of having just the one letter, you can customize how you want it to look. For example, you could say something like MMM for the month. Now capital, notice the capital versus lowercase, that is important. And the example here shows you that this would be JUN for June. All right, so whereas the capital, one more M would print out all of June, 2 M's would print out 06, and 1 would print out, that's the month and day. But if you did this one, it's going to say 6. So this kind of points out something that if you use one letter, then you're probably using one of these shortcuts that we've already done. But if you use multiple in the string, it's going to use those same letters, but because there's multiple, it's going to say, oh, you don't mean the single letter formatter, you mean the letter that represents a certain piece of the date time. Yes, that's confusing. So we reuse capital M either as month day, so June 15th, which I didn't show you up here, but you could do that. Or we use it as the month character, 1 or 2 digits in our date. So I'm going to use MMM for month, month, month. And then we need day. So I'll say DD for day of the month, 2 digits. So if it is less than 10, it's going to say like 09 or 08 as opposed to just 9 or 8. So DD, and then I can put a comma, and I can put YYYY. I can have a 4-digit year. Notice there is a 5-digit year you could have if you really wanted to have that leading 0. So, and then we can do is we can say from here, I can say I want, let's go with 2 hours. So that's going to have 07 because it's 7 o'clock at night. But notice it's lowercase h, but if I use uppercase H, I could get the 24-hour clock, and it would say what was it? It's 7 o'clock at night, so 7 plus 12 is 19 instead of 07. So we could choose that if we wanted to. I'm going to use the 12-hour clock. I'll hit colon, and because colon is not a formatting keyword or key letter, then it'll just print out that colon. So colon, and then I can say I want minutes, but again, get this right, lowercase 2m because the uppercase m's are months. Okay, I don't know how many times I have put the wrong uppercase versus lowercase and wondered why things look wacky. So, and then I can say, you know what, I don't want seconds, and then I want, let's do the T for AM PM. Okay, that'll show me if I'm in the AM or PM, and then I do want the time zone offset. Okay, so that's going to give me the ability to see the time zone. I'm sorry, not K. It would be just K if I wanted to have that, but I'm going to do ZZZ. Okay, that's going to be hour and minute offset for my time zone. So with that, if I run this, I will see that OCT 22 2021 7:35 p.m. -5. That's my offset. All right. So that gives you a lot more information about how your time is laid out. You could even say, you know what? I want more information, and you could get additional information, or you could change up how it lays out and so forth. For instance, if you're in Europe, you may want to see, let's just copy and paste this. You may want to see the day first, and then the month, like so. And actually, let's just put the slashes in instead. And then we'll do a 2-digit year. And then we'll do the 24-hour clock, which means we don't need it AM, PM, like so. And now we've taken that same object and format 22, 36. 36 doesn't seem right. Let's figure out what I did wrong there. Told you I'd mess it up. There we go. Capital M versus lowercase m. Whenever your month says 36, you got a problem. So 22nd of October, 2021 at 1936 with a -5 offset on our time. So that gives you the ability to format your date and time however you want. And that menu, whoops, I clicked off of here. Let's close it out. This menu here will give you a lot of great information about control space. Brings it back up, by the way. You can scroll through here and say, okay, what am I looking for here? I want the RFC 1123 date time. Well, that's just R. Not R in the middle of all this, but just R. But then you can have your formatters. Hey, you want the 1/1,000,000th of a second? Well, that's looks like 6 Fs, okay? Or 10 millionths of a second, looks like 7 Fs. I think if I can count the Fs correctly. So there's a lot of stuff in here you can play around with, try out, and get the date and time just how you want it. However, I would encourage you, if one of these works for you, then use one of those, because of the fact that by using one of those, you have a standard layout, okay? You don't have something that's a little custom, is a little bit different, and might not quite look right, all right? Now, let's, again, comment these out, and we're going to do a couple other things. Let's say DateTime sample 4. I like how it actually, hey, look at that. It kind of assumed some stuff there. But I want to say DateTime.parse. Okay? We can parse in based upon where I am from. So I'm in, my region is the US, therefore it's going to be month, day, year. So I can say 2021, that's March 11th, 2021. But I could also do DateTime sample 5 equals DateTime dot parse exact, and I can say that same string, all right, but this time I can say here's the format to give it: day, month, year, and we're going to give it the culture info, control dot to add that using for system.globalization, culture info dot invariant culture. Okay, what that means is we're not caring with the culture, we're just going to force it through in whatever format we decide is best. This is really helpful if you're bringing things in from a CSV file where people didn't listen to advice and do stuff like this. They did stuff like this where it's just a little off and the parse doesn't pick it up properly. No worries, you can do parse exact and switch it around. Notice I've done day first, which means this is the day, this is the month. So this is November 3rd instead of March 11th. And let's just print out each of these. So let's just print out sample 4 and sample 5. Yes, I'm not labeling them, but I think you can figure it out. But notice that March 11th versus November 3rd. Because of the fact that when we parsed this one, it based upon my current culture. My current culture says that month comes first, then day, then year. Whereas with parse exact, I overrode the culture and said, here's the format I want, and that's the data coming in. So if you're bringing data from a CSV, you would have the variable right here. They would bring it in from the CSV, loop through it, and you could convert it to a date time that you could then print off in any format you wanted to, because now you have it in a full date time object. Okay, so that's how you would parse out your date and time. Now, there are some new changes I've already shared in a 10-minute training video, but I wanted to show you here as well. There are some new changes to .NET 6 and C# 10 that make things a little bit easier for us. So we have two new types: date only, let's call it just date, or date one. And then we'll also have time only, time one. All right. Now, as I've talked about, date only and time only are not just portions of date time. They're a separate structure. Okay. They're not like date time because of the fact that date only stores, if you want to guess, it only stores dates. It does not store anything about time. And time only stores time. It does not store anything about date. So this can be very, very useful when you're saying things like the store opens at 8 in the morning and it closes at 9 at night. You're not talking about on a specific date. You're not talking about based upon which time zone you're in. You're talking about a specific time, okay? A set of times. And no, a time span wouldn't work there because a time span is the difference between two times. It's not two times, okay? So if you want open time, you'd have this as an open time. You'd have a separate time only as the close time. So same thing with your date here. That could be your birthday. Because if you store your birthday as a date time and it's, of course, midnight, well, what happens if someone interprets that from a different time zone? They could actually see your birthday as being in a different date because the fact the time zone offset might move it to the previous date or the previous date. So that would be problematic. So this way, we just store the date. We're not worrying about time zones. My birthday is the same day every year, regardless of what time zone I'm in. Okay? So yes, technically I was born in a specific time of day. I believe it was actually like 2 a.m. But, poor mom. But this represents just the date itself. Okay? So with date only and time only, we can't just say equals datetime.now. But we can say date only dot from datetime. And we give it a datetime.now. Now I'm hoping in future versions we can say date only from today or something like that. But this gives us then the date only. We can do the same exact thing with our time only, like so. Whoops. We should probably get the time only portion of that. But now we can say console write line date 1 and then console write line time 1. And if we run this, we'll see that the date only is 10:22 and the time only is 7:44. We have a lot of cool options on the date only and time only. So if we see date 1 dot, we have the day, we have to date time. So we can take this and a time only and make a date time. We also have the month, we have the day, we have the year. We can add days, add months, add years. We can compare to something else. And again, that will give us an integer that compares greater than, less than, or equal to. We have the day number, the day of the week, the day of the year, just like in our date time. And then we can print out different strings or format it however you want using the same formatting tools. But again, we don't get those formatting tools for things like time on date only. Okay, and the same is true for time as well. So if I said time 1, you're not going to see anything about the date in here, but you'll see hours, minutes, seconds, and so on that you can compare between. Again, you can play around a lot of these different things, but they're basically the time portions of what we had with date time, but just the time. And we have the date portions in date only, but just the date. So this really separates out date time into 2 distinct values if you need them. Okay, you would not just have 2 different values to hold date and time and try and keep them coordinated. You'd probably have just a date only or just a time only, depending on the need. If you need both, then date time is the way to go. As we've seen up here, lots of power to it, lots of stuff you can do with it, lots of ways you can manipulate and play around with it. But these will elevate your game when you're doing specific things that do not represent a specific date and time, but a general date or a general time. Okay? Now, we have not covered the date time offset, which date time offset, essentially what it does is it captures more information about the time zone so that we could have both the local time zone and UTC. And there can be some value in that, but primarily in C# we work with date time. So that's what I covered, and we're already well into the length that I wanted to get to for this video. I want to go beyond this. So we haven't covered date time offset. I may cover that in a future video. Let me know down in the comments if you want to see a specific date time offset video and some of the stuff you can do with that object as well. But this has been date time. And a little bit of time span too, because time span it just kind of fits right in with date time. But DateTime can do a ton of cool stuff. But now with date and time, we also have some flexibility to not have to kind of manipulate the date time to say, well, yeah, but at midnight. Or the time to just, it's year one, January 1st, but ignore that. Okay, we don't have to do that anymore. But whenever you're talking about date time, you want both of those pieces, then you want the date time type. If you just want a date or just want a time, those are now available in .NET 6, which is in Visual Studio 2022 and is being released in November of the year 2021. So that's all the cool stuff you can do in C#. Yes, there's some complexities here, and yes, there's ways that they could make it a whole lot better, but there is a third-party library out there that if you are interested in doing more with DateTime, that I encourage you to at least look at if you're struggling with the built-in DateTime stuff, and that is NodaTime, Nodatime. And that's a really great library that does some really cool stuff with DateTime. It really helps you work with it well and work with the different time zones and so on. So again, that's kind of outside of the scope of this video. If you want to see that featured in a video at some point, leave that message down in the comment and I will kind of keep track of who's looking for that. Okay. So thanks for watching. Thanks for going this deep dive here. Hopefully it was helpful. I'd love to know what your favorite part of DateTime is or what your thoughts are on the new date and time objects in .NET 6. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.